Hello to anyone who may be watching this video. I'm assuming it's not going to be too many people, considering this is my sort of first ever video review. I've written a few reviews on, well, I don't even want to call them reviews, but I have written a few reflections on literature on Goodreads and so forth, or the odd Reddit comment. But this is very much my first sort of attempt at a sort of video review on BookTube. I did want to say hello, BookTube, in the introduction, actually, but that really just seemed a little bit too presumptuous, considering, 5 or 10 views would be fantastic. So, yeah, I don't want to get ahead of myself or anything, particularly when this is my first review. However, anyway, welcome to this review of So Long, See You Tomorrow, which is a very short novel, verging almost, I'd say, it's in that sort of murky territory, or blurred territory, rather, between novel and novella, by William Maxwell. In short, really quite a lovely little book. Also, nevertheless, though, one that is, I found just ever so slightly frustrating, because the absolute, just these absolutely awesome moments of beauty, and just this really profound melancholy, and also just an exploration of memory, are sort of sometimes, those moments just sometimes are punctured just by the occasional, I would say, I don't even want to say misstep, because it's really, really, it is a misstep, but that almost sounds too strong. It's just one of those frustrating novels I found, that it's just not quite, it has these extraordinary moments, but it just doesn't quite nail the follow-through throughout. Anyway, before reviewing this book, I just thought I'd give a quick little preface. At the time of this video, I haven't actually recorded just a quick channel introduction I wanted to do. Just the sort of ethos of the channel and the sort of aesthetic, or which is very much a lack of aesthetic in a way, because as you can see here, I haven't really invested in any sort of production value other than just this iPhone which I'm recording on, and I haven't really tried too much. I've just found this nice sort of little alcove in the attic of my house. And this is in my house. I don't live in a tree house, although you may hear some birds in the background, kookaburras and magpies and and so forth, or channel-billed cuckoo bird as well, actually, sometimes can be heard. So but other than but I do not live in a tree house, just to get that out of the way. But no, I thought it'd be quite a nice background, because it is sort of, it's complementary to the novel in quite a few ways, considering that there is a motif of windows throughout, primarily windows at night, but obviously, as I just said, since I'm not particularly good with technology or interested in the production value, I'm not going to film a review at night facing a window, because it would look also just perhaps, it would just look, I think it could potentially look a bit creepy with me, sort of in imperfect lighting, in sort of shadow at night. But nevertheless, I thought it would be a nice background for this sort of novel. And one other part of the preface is that with this channel, I'm hoping to use minimal edits. You might see the odd cut, just because, if there's a sort of interruption, if I have to, if someone calls me on the phone and I have to pick up the camera, which is, obviously I'm not going to leave stuff like that in. Or, if I really, really just go on a grand waffle, which I can occasionally do, then obviously that will be taken out. So apologies if it's not quite as neat as some other reviews out there, but whenever I think of my absolute favorite BookTube channels at the moment, which I try and not watch, I'm trying to use social media less and less, but this is actually, what a great way to what a great introduction for my channel in the first video, saying how social media is really a sort of a blight on society, and not to engage in it. Don't engage with it, but maybe engage with my channel, because obviously I'm exempt from any of that sort of culpability in that sort of problematic system. I should also just quickly say I'm filming this at the end of the video, as the sun is setting and beginning to obscure my face, shining across my face, is that I should just say outright that, complete spoilers for this book. And I should say that's going to be true for the channel as well. Any book reviewed on the channel or discussed on the channel is that, I understand that some people are very much bothered buy spoilers. That's totally cool. They don't actually bother me. I don't really care that much about narrative in a way. I mean, I care about how it's delivered, but I don't really mind if something's spoiled. I'm a lot more interested in the sort of texture, the texture and the voices that are delivering the sort of narrative. So yeah, just a heads up, if you do actually want to read this before watching this review, just ignore this review. In fact, it may actually not be the worth it is to ignore this review generally, because having recorded a lot of it, it is quite a ramble, I must say. So yeah, and I'm not fantastic at sort of always neatly organizing all of my thoughts. Very much, I've been very influenced by modernist literature. So the stream of consciousness is always, sort of, I think, going to define my own voice. But anyway, I should probably get onto the novel. So William Maxwell is a writer who I've always been he's been on my radar for about, I'd say, a year and a half, 2 years now. And the thing that really attracted me to him was that he is primarily known as an editor of the New Yorker magazine for many, many years. I think in the introduction it probably says, I think, quite a few decades. Yes, editor for over 40 years. And the reason that really attracted me is that that was such an attractive quality to me, is because I guess for me, over the years, I've realized that my main sort of, that my taste in writing really revolves around the use of form and how form interacts with theme. And particularly also how the cerebral and the visceral are sort of blended together. So I always find it interesting. I guess for me, I just always really value the process of editing highly, and the precision around the written word and language. So if someone being an editor, they'd obviously have quite an acute critical eye and also a great deal of patience. One would expect. And it's also just interesting just to see the sort of difference in approach. I haven't read that many works by people who are also editors. Of course, many writers are professors of creative writing and so forth, or they might have worked at literary journals at a time or edited there. But it is very interesting to read works by people who are primarily known as editors. I'm thinking of a few short poems I've read by Gertrude Stein, for example. And I'm yet to read any of his work, but I've also heard it's quite interesting to actually read the work of Gordon Lish. And just the differences, but also many of the similarities in his voice and the manifold works that he has sort of been very heavily responsible for in his editing process. So basically, I just wanted to, if I read a book and I enjoy it, I'll just, maybe log a few notes on Goodreads and be done with it. But the reason I actually wanted to sort of record this review and discuss this book is because I think it does really, really interesting things with the idea of memory and sort of how traditional stories can actually hold, stories that we know quite well. This is a book about a murder in rural America, which is not exactly a new sort of setup, and it's quite a any sort of crime is of this kind is disturbing, but it's actually banal. It's over essentially just infidelity, adultery in this small town is really what drives it. So basically what I think is really interesting is when you get a book that has a sort of traditional setup and one that could be potentially exciting in a narrative way, and then what it actually does is it just sidesteps or eschews rather traditional narrative pleasures or sort of traditional representations of traditional narratives. And instead, it actually looks at how so many of these things that we think might be sort of familiar to us are actually quite unusual. Because what it does is, although the narrator remains unnamed, almost a sort of ghost-like figure, just because he is so haunted by his past, we do get his, we do get a biography of his early childhood. But when it's sort of, because he is speaking from many decades down the line, we get very, very little about what's actually happening in his present life. There's this sort of sense that, he's almost just sort of floating in this sort of, I don't know, like an empty house by the end of the novel. I think we only really get a description of the attic in his house at the very, towards the very end. So I think the really powerful point in this book, I'm just reading off some notes in the back of the book that I've defaced with my extremely poor handwriting. What I think's the really, really interesting thing is how it uses form and in a very, very powerful yet also subtle way. Because what you have here is this really grand sort of... The main technique on display here is omission. And it doesn't really fixate on it too much, although the narrator does, he is filling in gaps of other people's stories. But what I think is so interesting is what it omits about his own life. As I said, you don't really ever find much out about him, but you find so much out about all these other figures around him. Even people he never really knew that well, because he'll often sort of invent explanations for them. In fact, an entire, a massive chunk of the middle of this book for about, I don't know, it's sort of hard to see, but I'd say, for about that much of it, it's very much actually just an invented history of the two families, the ones that were involved in this sort of a dispute around adultery and then this eventual murder that resulted out of that. Because he actually doesn't, he only has a few records to the court cases to the court hearings and then the case around it, and also only a few newspapers that actually reported on the story. So there's actually not that much that he actually has available. But what I think is really interesting is that not only, of course, you have this thing about, how memory is, quite highly, fraught with danger almost, and it sort of, is far patchier than people like to accept. And then, of course, that then means that so much of our conceptions of self are a lot more, they're much looser than we typically like to think. But what I think is really interesting is the narrator never really focuses on it, but how he omits so much of his own past throughout this novel. All we really get are histories of other people. There's almost this implicit suggestion throughout this sort of grand omission how perhaps we actually sometimes perhaps have actually less to say on our own narratives than other people. That isn't to say that we can understand other people better, but perhaps because we see them, externally from afar, and we sort of, we can sort of in our own way feel more comfortable about sort of freezing them, in sort of outlines, and then actually sort of, chronicling their various actions and beginning to understand their psyches. Whereas, when you're in your own body, it's just sort of this constant flux, and it's very, very hard to track, even where you were sometimes, a week ago and so forth. In fact, that's actually part of the appeal I even found in recording video reviews in the first place, is that it sort of is it does double as a video diary, not just not just a sort of a discussion for the the sort of booktube or the online literary crowd, but it actually is also just a sort of interesting way just to track your own thoughts. And I've even found that letterboxd reviews I'll leave and so forth. Or just any form of writing, even just random little notes you might jot down on the notes app, or on your phone, or even just on paper. Although I forget about. I sometimes forget that paper does exist. At least paper you can actually write on, not just paper you read a book on. Because I do probably use the notes app a little bit too much on my phone, and it can get a little bit unwieldy sometimes to actually dive back through it and just see where I was in the past. But aside from the sort of formal or structural omission, there is actually direct omission within the themes as well, and just within the direct content, because the whole novel is really driven by this very, very simple act of omission that does haunt the narrator, which is basically that he saw his best friend Cletus, who was the son of the murderer in question, and he sees him in a high school in Chicago when he's moved there, and he just walks straight past him in the hallway. He sort of freezes, and he does recognize him, and he knows that he recognizes him as well, but he doesn't actually say anything, and that sort of begins to haunt him, because then he worries, well, perhaps this student, this old friend of his, and now peer, quite an estranged peer, at high school, moved on just because he was worried that perhaps this narrator, would besmirch him, or sort of define him, secretly behind other people's backs. And so he's extremely, and also just this sense that he never actually, presented warmth to him when he really could have used it. So again, I think that's what's really interesting is that, again, the murder in it is actually sort of, it's almost put to the sidelines, whereas actually the most damaging thing for the narrator is, of course, the murder is very haunting for him, but is actually just this very, very small action, of just all this very small omission, just a failure to sort of offer empathy and warmth in this small moment. And I think it's such a poignant thing, and I think again it's just wonderful when a book can take when you have like a big sort of piece of plotting like a murder, and then you actually just shift it to the side and then again zoom in on what is actually what's actually sort of bothering or haunting the narrator. So yeah, it's really interesting to get this juxtaposition between the large and small, and that actually it's often these very, very small details that win out in the end, and that people end up sort of fixating on. I'm actually going to read the last part of the very, very last part because it's such a beautiful just a beautiful sentence, because it really also explores what's interesting is that it also is looking at, I think, that there's sort of an inevitability of omission in our own lives, in the sense that there'll always be sort of an omission of our own actions that actually we are very good and very capable, and we do actually have the capacity to define other people's stories very well, but often we have very, very little control in defining our own stories, both through just, because it's difficult to actually understand our own selves. The narrator throughout really wonders why his own body has, made him feel the way he sometimes does, and that, he actually wants to move on from this incident, and this sort of, this haunting incident, but yet, something within him just can't. Actually, before I read the ending, there is a great little passage towards the start, which I have marked. Yes, which I think captures this idea quite well, just this first idea of how we have trouble defining our own stories. Before even looking outwards, we have trouble looking inwards often, and just fully understanding these impulses that exist within us, or these various feelings. So this is on page 54. In that insufficiently heated bedroom on the northwest corner of the house in Park Place, I was taken by surprise by the first intimations of a pleasure that I did not at first know how to elicit from or return to the body that gave rise to it, which was my own. It had no images connected with it, and no object but pure physical sensation. It was as if I had found a way of singing that did not come from the throat. I stumbled upon it by accident, and it did not cross my mind that anybody might ever have had this experience except me. Therefore, I did not connect these piercing, exquisite sensations with the act of murder that removed Cletus Smith from Lincoln, or with what other men and women did that was all right for them to do, provided they were married. So, it's just that's just quite a lovely little passage, and you sort of get these various interruptions throughout of thought from the narrator. But now I'll go to the last, just the very last sentence. And this is where I think it gave me a lot to think about with sort of this secondary idea of the difficulty in defining one's own narrative, which is that, particularly when many people know one's story, such as in a small town like this, it becomes, it's very difficult to actually control your own sort of narrative. And actually, people end up being defined by others in a very sort of unfortunate way, rather than being able to sort of exert their own stories. But it isn't only my failure that I think about. I also wonder about him, about what happened to him, whether he was spared the sight of his father's drowned body, whether after a while he and his mother were able to look at each other often without embarrassment, whether he had as lonely a time as I did when he first moved to Chicago, and whether the series of events that started with the murder of Lloyd Wilson, whether all that finally began to seem less real, more like something he dreamed, so that instead of being stuck there, he could go on and by the grace of God lead his own life, undestroyed by what was not his doing. So that's just to me a really beautiful passage. It's just one of the many beautiful passages you get throughout the novel. That people, and again, it's that sort of double negative construction that you get throughout. It's quite hard to explain, but that idea of undestroyed by what was not his doing. So again, it's always these things that people aren't, that again they're being defined by things they haven't done. Rather than actually just these usual constructions of saying, he is a wonderful person. You might instead get, something like, he never wasn't, he never was not, a good person or something like that. It's this sort of, and it's this sort of double negative. I'm calling it double negative. It's not quite, but it's these sort of double negative, quite, almost clunky in a deliberate way. These constructions where it sort of shows that nothing is, very easy in how we perceive of others and so forth. So, just as an example, here's an example of this sort of what I'm calling the double negative structure of so many of these of the sentences or the clauses here. Cletus still wasn't worried. His father had never not given them anything for Christmas. You get sentences like that throughout the book, and as I said, it really just shows that that people and emotions are never straightforward, and that actually so many of these characters and the narrator themselves, because the narrator is narrating these people's lives, is that that they're actually sort of defined by absences. What they aren't, rather than just what they are, or the people aren't thinking so much in an active way, but sort of always thinking, well, someone isn't that or not that. There's never a clarity to what other people are. It's rather this sort of grasping for characterization. And again, just an absolutely sort of fascinating use of, and very subtle use of language. It just shows how attuned Maxwell is to narration. Speaking of how well attuned he is to language, I mean, you just have, there's a really, there's just so many interesting little devices here. For example, how on many pages you'll see that the sort of, when he's describing this history, that the paragraphs are actually separated just by blank spaces, when there's sort of being jumps in perspective and so forth. But that actually, when you get to longer passages, such as towards the end here, you actually get, just there, you get dinkuses being used, or asterisms. On the page as well. That sort of just, again, and these are for like longer time jumps, but also for when there's sort of like more of a sense of, a really imposing sort of interruption. A real forceful interruption that, is a lot more, it's less elliptical and less dreamy than those sort of blank spaces. So again, just a wonderful, wonderful care placed towards, the typography itself and these typographical details. So, all in all, absolutely worth a read for anyone. I think anyone, but particularly if you are interested in writing yourself, just to see, again, before going into narratives, actually stop and look at what is sort of informing the narrative. What are the various filters and forces that are that are acting on the narrative or the novel's construction. That entire idea, actually, which is, that's what I'm always, that's really is what I'm interested in. There's a Cormac McCarthy quote, which is quite, I'm paraphrasing, but, it's, about how, he never wanted to read a book that didn't discuss death, which I actually think is a very sort of valid expectation in a way. But at the same time, I guess for me, it's more like I would never want to read a book that isn't aware of perception, and its own construction, and what effects these things have on the viewer. Or the reader. I'm talking in film terms, viewer, because I was going to say I've mostly been informed. That sort of thinking was very informed by Mulholland Drive as a film, and also Mikhail Haneke's Cache as a movie. But also, what really, I think when I first really thought about it in a novel was when I read Gerald Murnane's The Plains, which is probably my favorite novel of all time. Well, not probably, it is, but it will probably remain my favorite novel of all time. And just quickly, I just found this other brilliant little quotation here on page 128 that really does also link in nicely, or that dovetails to this sort of this point in the conversation about the degree of autonomy we possess over our own stories. Whether they are part of home or home is part of them is not a question children are prepared to answer. So just a really, really wonderful little passage there. Or really a sentence, not a passage. The other reason I really want to talk about this novel is because I think it's a very, very interesting look at perception. But of course, many books look at perception. But what I find what I really like with a novel like this, and in fact, in many ways, it sort of reminded me of this other novel that I read earlier in the year. Hang on, I'm covering the title, Distant Star by Roberto Bolaño. There's quite a few similarities between the two because they sort of, on the surface, seem almost like airport books in a way, because they're all sort of about, crime or sort of, political wrongs or, sort of criminal wrongs and acts of violence. But really, when you actually zoom in on them, you realize that the entire sort of, this sort of potentially entertaining concept there's not really so much of a narrative there. It's actually much more about how that sort of information, the sort of forces that mediate it. So not only the voices of these narrators, both of whom are extremely, extremely distant, and actually both of whom remain unnamed. And there's sort of these, almost sort of these spectatorial specters in a way. Very much off to the periphery of the main action, of the main events. Sort of these commentators who are just incredibly haunted by history, but yet they can't move on from it. They've just become completely obsessed by it, completely buried in it. So what I think it's really interesting when a writer, rather than just have narration be a sort of vehicle for story and narrative, actually stops, sort of parks the vehicle. And then begins to actually examine that vehicle and consider the various components that are actually moving it along. It examines what is going on, the sort of mechanisms and the mechanics that are driving, that are driving the events, and of course also what is driving the narrator, because the narrator is the person who is ultimately allowing us to glimpse these events. Because without them, there would just be a blank page, of course. Really without the author as well, and. Actually, on that, I should say, I was going to mention this, I also like how there is a very interesting blending of the personal, that although these are fictional narrators, there's a huge amount of the authors within these as well, which again goes back to, The Plains by Murnane that I mentioned earlier. Murnane deals in what he calls the sort of true fiction idea, which is that it's neither, complete fiction, but it's also not really, it's this really interesting grey area where the entire book is almost just basically occurring within the writer's head, yet at the same time there is this sort of diegetic framework where there is actually also a reality to the events that's really interesting. But yeah, I just wish that you sort of, I'd really like to know if anyone has any recommendations for books that are similar to this, actually. Where it's, you do have these initial premise, really intriguing premises rather, that are actually then just stopped just to look rather at the sort of narrator and some of the various forces acting on the novel's construction, and also just the construction of the history of the other characters. I think, particularly in a time where, social media and everything like that, people are, attention spans are shortening, and, my attention span was absolutely just, it was infinitesimally short for a long time, or infinitesimally small for a long time. And I managed to, gain it back a little bit. It's still very much not perfect by any means. But, I think in a time like this, it's just really good to get books that you can read like this, where it actually shows that there's so much value in just putting we're not screeching to a halt, but just gently coming to a stop, putting the foot on the brake, and just coming to a stop, and actually just thinking, about how we construct stories and the sort of effects that can have, just the construction and the sort of, and also how it affects our own identities. And our own voices as well. And I also just think there's a really, just a sort of interesting, these are both very interesting novels at looking at how, at just how, I suppose hauntings can occur without even a supernatural force. That you have these two narrators who are haunted by different aspects of their lives, feeling like they've sort of failed in different ways. And again, they're both sort of what I call spectatorial specters, or or spectral spectators almost, because they are at the periphery of the main events, but at the same time they've been so heavily defined by it, which I think is another very, very, very relevant sort of viewpoint to assume, because again, I think today so many people can feel like, so many young people around my age, or just really anyone of any age, can feel like they are not at the center at all of their own stories, of the world, and that not only are they not at the center, they're not, even in the immediate orbit. They're often like a very, very off, very much off in the periphery. So I think it's just a very sort of interesting and immediately evocative and, in a way, sort of relatable viewpoint to take. That it may not be as immediately engaging as some, but it actually becomes a lot more engaging in a way, because it's just so true to so many readers, I suppose, and so many people generally in life. So I didn't mean for this to become. I also very much recommend Distant Star. I actually slightly prefer this, I'd say, to this. Again, I felt I still had a few little hold-ups on this one, but again, this would be a very strong 4 out of 5. Yeah, I mean, and I should say I would include half, like 4.5 to 5. So, just in my sort of my rating system, which is not at all very robust. And it's again it's a little bit flimsy when you get up to certain zones, like if something's good, like really good like these, it's a little bit blurry. Something's like a 4 or 4.5. So nevertheless, although you do have, although I absolutely recommend this, because it is a wonderful little read. I do, I don't, it's not quite, if I have to sort of do an arbitrary sort of, not arbitrary, but if I do have to, give it a rating, I would give it a 4 out of 5. It seems like I've been very gushing about it. It is wonderful. It has so many moments of beauty. Nevertheless, there's just the, because it is so beautifully written overall, that when you do get the odd sentence that just is a little bit awkwardly constructed or just doesn't flow quite as well or do as much as some of the others, that they actually do stick out a lot more. That's sort of almost the risk you run. It's almost better to be a mediocre writer in a way, because, the missteps, they don't stick out as much. They sort of just fall to the background. And the other thing is that, I have mentioned that so much of the middle of the novel is this sort of invented history that the narrator undertakes. He embarks on it to sort of, fill the gaps in the life of his friend Cletus and, and the two families. One Cletus's family, then the other one that were involved, in this horrific event. And although that is very interesting, because the most interesting part is that you have to wonder, is the narrator, or not even the narrator, but is Maxwell himself potentially just describing his own history here? Because it is so specific and so detailed, that I know we get details of the narrator's past, but one must wonder if perhaps it is the narrator or Maxwell potentially dropping in little interpolating little fragments of their own life, of their own lives into this fictional history. But yes, it's just sort of the way it pivots to this fictional history when he's talking about lifting up cards and looking at the various figures there, as a metaphor. It's a little bit abrupt how it's introduced. And I also think that since, this history is completely invented, there is still, sometimes a sense to it that it is a little bit immaterial just because it is completely invented. It's always very interesting to see how characters, think about other people, because that is actually very telling about themselves. Again, it's going back to that central sort of motif or theme of omission, and how omissions are actually, often these absences inform more than what is actually, immediately before us, to sort of examine. But nevertheless, yeah, it does sometimes become a little bit immaterial because, it is just an invented history. The narrator admits that they don't know a lot, they don't know almost anything about these people. And that I also just was a little bit put off by, I do very much subscribe to many sort of postmodern tenets, but at the same time, I don't really like when a novel just goes, oh, well, like, the past and history are completely, they're completely made up. Because, what do we know? There's really no truth there. And I just thought the way that was introduced just sort of, just again undermine that whole passage, because it's like, well, it just sort of removes some of the power to it, because you just think, well, or it doesn't really move, it just sort of removes some of the power to the entire book, because, it has this lovely reflective tone, but when you sort of get very just direct statements like that are sort of, that don't really expand on their own logics, it is just a little bit disappointing. It does sort of hamper that, not hamper, but it does sort of shrink the sort of, this lovely sort of scope, this reflective scope that so much of the book does have. So anyway, those are some brief, or at least what attempted to be brief, thoughts on So Long, See You Tomorrow by William Maxwell. Before I sign off, I just simply just like to throw a few questions out to anyone watching. Because it's not, I don't just want this channel to just be one where it's a sort of a lecture series by a dilettante lecture series by someone who doesn't really know what they're actually talking about. I would actually much prefer it to be a sort of opportunity for discussion. So just out of curiosity, if you've read the novel, what did you think about it? And what were your thoughts on it? Do you personally, how much of the sort of invented history in it do you think is actually that of the narrator, or how much do you think is it just purely fiction? And lastly, what do you think about memory? I'd be very curious to just read various thoughts on that, because it is just something that I always return to. Those really cool mechanics that mediate our entire existences. The filters through which we access and craft our realities. So yeah, what do you think about memory? How much of it do you think is fictional? How much of it is just extreme? Is just concrete? And that if it is highly subjective, what does that sort of mean for our own histories? It's a very, I think it's an interesting question that this book ponders, and I'd be, it's always very rewarding to get other people's perspectives, because people are always picking up on stuff that completely goes over my head, or that I've completely missed. So that would be very interesting. Anyway, thank you for your time. If you have stuck through and endured these ramblings, hopefully you gain something from that, or if you even if you disagree, that that your views are sort of challenged, and now you've sort of maybe feel like your opinion has been strengthened in some way by hearing another perspective on the book. So thank you very much for your time, and see you in the next video.